The call came in at 11:47 on a Tuesday night, and Claudette Marois almost didn't pick it up. She was elbow-deep in paperwork at the nurses' station on the third floor of Riverview Veterans Care Centre in Thunder Bay, Ontario. The kind of paperwork that never ends, that multiplies overnight like something alive, that follows you home in your sleep. The fluorescent light above her had been flickering for 6 days. Maintenance had been notified twice. Nobody came. This was how things worked at Riverview, and Claudette had stopped being surprised by it years ago. Somewhere around the time she stopped being surprised by a lot of things. The call was from the emergency intake desk downstairs. A new admission, nonverbal, combative, refusing assessment, nothing unusual, and then the intake coordinator added one more thing, almost as an afterthought. He has a cat with him, a big orange one. He won't let anyone near it. Claudette set down her pen. His name was Corporal Warren Holt, retired, though the paperwork kept oscillating between corporal and master corporal, depending on which form you were reading, and Claudette made a note to get that sorted before it became a problem. 51 years old, 2 tours in Afghanistan with the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, a TBI from an IED outside Kandahar in 2009, chronic pain, chronic insomnia, and PTSD so layered and calcified that 3 previous treatment programs had discharged him as non-compliant, which, in Claudette's experience, was often just clinical language, for we didn't know what to do with him. He was sitting in the corner of the intake room when she got there. Not on the chair. On the floor, back against the wall, knees pulled up slightly, one hand resting on his thigh, and the other wrapped around a large orange tabby cat that was draped across his chest like a living heating pad. The cat was enormous, nearly 12 pounds of self-satisfied fur, and it was watching the room with the mild imperial disinterest of something that had never once questioned its own importance. 2 orderlies were standing near the door. The intake coordinator, a young man named Brouillard, was hovering near the desk with the look of someone who had run out of options and was now waiting for someone else to produce new ones. Warren Holt did not look up when Claudette walked in. She didn't try to make him. She pulled a chair away from the desk, turned it around, and sat down roughly 5 feet from him. Close enough to be present, far enough to not be a threat. She did this without announcing it. She did not say, "Hi, I'm your nurse," or "Can I help you tonight?" or any of the other phrases that sounded like care, but functioned more like barriers, scripted openings that told a person you were running a protocol rather than paying attention to them. She just sat. The cat looked at her. Blinked once slowly, the way cats do when they've decided you're probably not dangerous. Warren Holt kept his eyes on the middle distance. After about 90 seconds without moving, he said, "They're going to try to take him." His voice was flat, not hostile. Just certain, the way you're certain about things you've already had confirmed multiple times by experience. Claudette said, "Who told you that?" The guy at the desk. A pause. "Before you. He said animals weren't permitted in patient rooms." Claudette looked over at Brouillard. Brouillard looked at the floor. She turned back. "What's his name?" A beat of silence. Then, with something that was almost caution, "Sergeant, is that his rank or his name?" For the first time, Warren Holt's eyes moved. They tracked to her slowly, the way a scope adjusts, deliberate, precise, assessing. He looked at her for a long moment. "His name," he said. Claudette nodded. "Sergeant seems like he knows what he's doing." The cat, as if on cue, shifted his weight slightly and resettled himself against Warren's chest with a sound like a small engine turning over. Warren's hand moved, just a fraction, just enough to rest more fully on the cat's back. "He does," Warren said, and said nothing else. Riverview Veterans Care Centre had been open for 11 years. It was not a VA hospital in the American sense. Canada's system worked differently. Veterans Affairs Canada overseeing long-term care through contracted facilities, but it served the same population, the same invisible weight. Men and women who had come home from places that didn't let go of them, who had spent years being told they were fine, or that what they felt wasn't real, or that they needed to push through it, or that the program wasn't designed for cases like theirs. Claudette had worked there for 4 years. Before that, she had been a medical officer with the Canadian Forces for 6, attached to units at CFB Petawawa, deployed once to Latvia as part of an OP reassurance rotation, and once, briefly and badly, to a role that appeared on her service record simply as theater support, undisclosed location, which was the kind of note that told you everything and nothing at the same time. She did not talk about this at work, not because she was ashamed of it or protective of it, but because she had learned, slowly and then all at once, that people heard what they expected to hear. When civilians heard I was in the military, they heard you shot a gun or you saw combat, neither of which captured the reality of what 6 years as a forces medical officer actually looked like. The hours in sick parades, the mental health assessments, the soldiers who came to you about physical symptoms that weren't physical, the particular loneliness of being the person responsible for other people's resilience while your own developed hairline fractures you didn't notice until much later. So she didn't talk about it. She just did her job, and sometimes her job included knowing things that weren't in the training manuals. What she knew, watching Warren Holt in that intake room, was this: he wasn't being difficult. He was doing exactly what his nervous system had learned to do to keep him alive. He was maintaining a perimeter. He was watching the exits. He was keeping the one thing he trusted within arm's reach. The problem was that nobody else in that building understood that, and they were about to make it worse. She found out about it the next morning. She had gone home at 2 a.m. after Warren had been settled, still on the floor, initially, Sergeant the Cat still annexed to his chest, until eventually, incrementally, he had accepted being moved to an actual bed, on the condition that Sergeant came with him, which Claudette had authorized on her own initiative and written up in the chart under patient comfort measures, medically indicated. She came back for her 7 a.m. shift and learned that Dr. Pelletier had reviewed the chart overnight. Dr. Etienne Pelletier was the facility's senior psychiatrist. He had been at Riverview for 9 years, which was 2 years longer than the facility had technically had a senior psychiatrist position, a piece of institutional history that he referenced often and that Claudette had come to understand meant I built this place from nothing, and I will continue to run it as I see fit. He was not a bad doctor. He was not unkind. He was, in Claudette's careful and private assessment, the kind of clinician who had stopped updating his internal model of what patients needed somewhere around 2014 and had been running on that firmware ever since. He had left a note in the chart. Holt, W. Animal not to remain in patient room. Infection control policy 4.7b. Arrange removal AM rounds. Pelletier. Claudette read it twice. Then she read infection control policy 4.7b, which covered non-service animals and pets in patient care areas, which was the relevant designation because Sergeant did not have a service animal certification. He was not a psychiatric service cat in any officially registered sense. He was a large orange tabby who slept on a veteran's chest and, according to Warren's sparse intake paperwork, had been doing so every night for the past 3 years, and who was, in Claudette's clinical judgment, the primary reason Warren Holt had not been admitted to a crisis unit 6 months ago. But that was not in the paperwork, and Dr. Pelletier had not asked. She went to find him before rounds. He was in his office, which smelled like coffee and the particular kind of authority that accumulates in small rooms over long periods. He listened to her. He let her finish. He even nodded at a couple of points, the way people do when they're constructing their counterargument rather than actually listening. Claudette, he said when she was done, I understand your concern, but we have infection protocols for a reason. We have standards. If we make exceptions for one patient, this isn't about making an exception, she said. This is about recognizing that Sergeant functions as a therapeutic support. Informal, yes. Undocumented, yes. But functionally equivalent to. Functionally equivalent isn't certified. He said it gently. We can't run a care facility on informal. You know that. She knew that. She also knew that Warren Holt had a documented history of acute dissociative episodes when separated from the cat. It was in the discharge notes from his last facility, buried in the 4th page of a 6-page summary, in language that was so clinical it nearly obscured what it was describing. A man in his 50s lying on a floor, unable to speak, because something he trusted had been taken away from him. She mentioned this. Pelletier glanced at his calendar. We'll assess him this morning. If the cat is genuinely therapeutic, we can look at a formal emotional support animal designation, which takes time and proper documentation. In the meantime, policy is policy. She left his office with the specific kind of calm that comes just before something breaks. Rounds began at 9. By 9:15, Warren Holt knew something was wrong. He didn't say anything. He rarely said anything. But Claudette, standing just inside the doorway of his room, watched his body language shift the way weather shifts before a storm. Incremental, atmospheric, something tightening in the set of his shoulders and the angle of his jaw. Sergeant, still on the bed beside him, had stopped purring. Pelletier came in with 2 residents and reviewed the chart at the foot of the bed. He spoke about Warren in the third person, the way clinicians sometimes do without realizing it or without caring. This strange habit of discussing a person in front of them as if they were furniture. He mentioned the cat removal, not as something to be considered, but as something already decided. One of the residents moved toward the bed. Warren Holt stood up. He did it without any of the warning signs that usually preceded a situation. No raised voice, no visible escalation. He simply went from sitting to standing, and the quality of the room changed completely. The resident stopped moving. Pelletier took a half step back. The other resident, to his credit, didn't move at all. Warren didn't reach for anything. He didn't make any threatening gesture. He just stood there between the bed and the resident, and the thing he communicated without words was very clear and very old and very practiced. "You will not touch what is mine." Claudette stepped into the room. "Dr. Pelletier," she said, and her voice was very even. "Can I have a moment with the patient before we proceed?" Pelletier looked at her. He was calculating something. She could see it. The balance between his authority and the optics of what was happening in this room, the 2 residents watching, the patient standing in a ready posture that anyone with any background would recognize as not a good sign. He nodded. 5 minutes, he said, and took the residents out. The door closed. Claudette looked at Warren. Warren was still standing, but the terrible readiness in him had shifted slightly, redistributed, the way a current shifts when an obstacle is removed. He was watching her. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. Sergeant immediately climbed onto his lap. Claudette pulled up the chair. Sat where she'd sat the night before. Same distance, same angle. "He's going to remove Sergeant," Warren said. "It wasn't a question." "He's trying to," she said, "and you're going to help him." She shook her head. "No." He looked at her for a long time, the same slow scope adjustment she'd seen the night before. Looking for the lie. Looking for the place where the words didn't match the intention, which is what you learn to look for when you've been lied to by systems enough times. "Why not?" he said finally. Claudette had a lot of ways she could have answered that. She could have talked about patient-centered care, about therapeutic animals, about her clinical assessment. All of it would have been true. All of it would have landed like policy. She said something else instead. Something she almost never said at work. "Because I know what it costs," she said quietly, "when they take away the thing that's keeping you here." Warren went very still. Sergeant purred. She didn't explain further. She didn't need to. What she watched happen in the next few seconds was not a decision. It was more like a recognition. The slow unlocking of something that had been bolted shut against exactly this kind of intrusion, against the possibility that someone in a building like this might know something real. He said, "He's been with me since I got back. 3 years. Every night. I know. He wakes me up when it starts." His voice was factual, steady in the way of things that have been steadied through great effort. "Before it gets bad, I don't know how he knows. He just does." "That's not unusual," she said. "Cats are more attuned than people think." He nodded once, looking down at Sergeant. "They're going to say it's not documented." "It's not," she said, "yet." He looked up. "I'm going to document it," she said. "All of it, what you just told me. The history from your previous discharge summary, my clinical observations from last night. I'm going to build the file that Sergeant needs in order to stay in this room, and I'm going to have it on Pelletier's desk before he does another round." A pause. "Can you do that?" "I already started." Something passed across Warren Holt's face that wasn't quite an expression. It was more like an absence, the absence of the bracing, of the preparation for another impact, of the particular exhaustion of someone who has learned that hope is expensive and usually pointless. It lasted only a second, and then his face went neutral again. But Claudette had seen it. She spent the next 3 hours building the case. It was not glamorous work. It was the work of forms, of phone calls, of rifling through policy documents and the Veterans Affairs Canada guidelines on therapeutic and emotional support animals, of which there were more than she remembered, and which were, critically, more permissive than Pelletier's reading of facility policy suggested. She called the VAC district office in Thunder Bay. She spoke with a case coordinator named Gendron, who had been in the system long enough to know exactly which provisions applied and how. She called the previous facility, a long-term care center in Sudbury, and spoke with the social worker who had been Warren's point of contact there. The social worker's name was Isabeau Tremblay, and she had been quietly furious about Warren's discharge for months. She provided Claudette with a summary of every incident in the 18-month record that involved the cat's absence and Warren's deterioration, formatted clearly, sent by secure fax within 40 minutes. She wrote up her own clinical observations from the previous night and from the morning's incident. She was specific. She was measured. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The facts were doing all the necessary work without any embellishment. Then she went to find Dr. Pelletier. He was not pleased to see her. He was in the middle of a conversation with the facility administrator, Cote, which was its own problem. Cote was an efficient man with good intentions and an overwhelming preference for anything that did not generate paperwork or, worse, complaints. But Claudette had learned, sometime in her second year at Petawawa, that timing matters more than almost anything else. You don't ask for something when the other person is ready. You ask when the information makes the asking unnecessary. She set the folder on Pelletier's desk. I wanted to make sure you had the full clinical picture before this afternoon's rounds, she said. He looked at the folder. He looked at her. He opened it. She watched him read. She watched him get through the VAC guidelines, which contradicted his reading of Policy 4.7 by in a way that was unmistakable. She watched him reach the Sudbury records and the documentation of what had happened, in detail and in sequence, every time Sergeant had been removed or inaccessible. She watched him read her own clinical notes. He said nothing for a long time. "This is Tremblay's assessment from Sudbury?" he said finally. "Yes. She sent it this morning." He turned a page. He read something. He turned it back and read it again. "These incidents," he said, 3 in 18 months, all documented as directly temporally correlated with the cat's absence, she said, within 48 hours each time. He closed the folder. Cote was watching all of this with the careful neutrality of a man who has learned that outcomes he doesn't understand are easier to let other people determine. Pelletier said, "You're proposing we formally designate Sergeant as an emotional support animal under the VAC provisions." "I'm not proposing it," Claudette said carefully. "I'm noting that the clinical evidence and the governing policy both support it, and that the documentation to establish it formally is largely complete. I just need your signature on the clinical endorsement." A pause. "And if I don't agree," he said. She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully. "Then I'd want to make sure the chart reflects all the relevant information before this afternoon's rounds," she said, "including the material from Sudbury and the VAC provisions and my clinical notes from last night." For completeness, what she was describing was not a threat. It was an accurate account of what a nurse is supposed to do. But they both understood what a complete chart looked like if Warren Holt experienced an acute episode after Sergeant's removal, and who had reviewed that chart and made the removal order, and what a subsequent review might find. Pelletier looked at her for a long time. Then he reached for a pen. She told Warren herself. She knocked, came in, sat down in the same chair. "He signed it," she said. "Sergeant stays." Warren looked at the cat, who was installed on the bed beside him, with imperial composure. Then he looked at Claudette. "You went around him," he said. "I went through the correct channels with complete documentation," she said. "It's not the same thing." He almost smiled. It was small, barely there, more a shift in the geography of his face than an actual expression. But it was real. "You were in," he said. "Not a question. The way you say it when you know." She looked at him. "CFB Petawawa," she said. 6 years, medical officer." He nodded slowly, like something had just been confirmed that he had suspected since the night before. Like the thing she'd said, "I know what it costs when they take away the thing keeping you here," had landed differently than it would have if she'd just been a nurse who read a lot. "Oh, patina," he asked. "Theater support," she said. Which was all she said, which was enough. He nodded again. Sergeant chose that moment to stand up, stretch enormously in the way that only cats can do with full theatrical commitment, and then walk across the bed to the edge nearest Claudette and sit down directly in front of her, tail curled around his feet, looking at her with his amber eyes. She put her hand out. He sniffed it. Then he pressed his head against her palm, and she scratched behind his ears, while Warren Holt watched with the expression of someone watching something they weren't sure they believed was happening. "He doesn't do that," Warren said. "Usually." "I know," she said. "I was told I have a trustworthy face." This time he actually smiled. Brief, rusty, like a hinge that hadn't moved in a while, but real. What came after was slower and less dramatic and probably more important. Claudette filed a formal complaint with Riverview's Patient Care Committee regarding the intake process for Warren's admission, specifically the verbal communication by the intake coordinator that had set the expectation that Sargent would be removed before any clinical assessment had been made. The complaint was not about Brouillard personally, it was about a practice. The habit of resolving ambiguity with the most restrictive possible interpretation of policy rather than the most patient-centered one. She copied the complaint to VAC's regional office, and she did not do this quietly. She did it through the proper channels, with names on everything, with dates and times, and the specific language used. Gendron at VAC, it turned out, had been waiting for exactly this kind of documented case for 8 months. There were 2 other facilities in northwestern Ontario with similar patterns. The complaint became part of something larger, which was not what Claudette had set out to create, but which she did not discourage. Pelletier did not apologize, but he signed off on an in-service training day for the clinical staff, trauma-informed care for veteran populations, and he did not fight her when she recommended it also include a module on therapeutic animals. She counted this as progress, which is not the same as victory, but is considerably more durable. Warren Holt stayed at Riverview for 4 months. He was not an easy patient. He had decades of carefully constructed defenses, and they did not come down on any particular schedule. There were good days and difficult days and days that were neither, just the flat gray effort of being alive and dealing with what being alive required. But he slept. Sargent saw to that. And sleeping was the foundation of everything else, the capacity to be in a room with people, to tolerate the noise and unpredictability of a care facility, to occasionally participate in the morning group that Claudette ran on Thursdays, which was not called therapy because Warren would not have come if it was called therapy, but which was a room with chairs and coffee where people could say things or say nothing. He said things, eventually. Not all at once, not in confessional bursts. But incrementally, the way a lake thaws in late April, from the edges first, slowly over time. He talked about Afghanistan. He talked about the specific quality of the light in the hour before an operation, and how that quality of light had been stuck in his vision for 15 years, coming back at him in late afternoons when the sun was at a certain angle. He talked about the men he'd served with, and the specific loneliness of being the one who came home with all his limbs and most of his hearing, and still feeling like he'd lost something fundamental and untranslatable. He talked about his brother in Sault Ste. Marie, who he hadn't spoken to in 4 years, and whether it was too late to call. Claudette said she didn't know, but that she'd noticed it wasn't usually as late as people thought, and that 4 years was not actually that long, in the context of a whole life. He didn't call that week. But a few weeks later, she noticed he was on the phone in his room for over an hour, and Sargent was on the bed beside him the whole time. The morning he was discharged, he came to the nurse's station before breakfast. Sargent was in his carrier, a dignified wire door affair that Sargent regarded with imperious tolerance rather than distress. Warren set it on the desk. He looked at Claudette. He said, "I didn't think there was anyone in a building like this who actually..." And then he stopped and started again. "I've been through 4 of these places. I know," she said. "It's not." He paused again. He was a man who chose words carefully, partly by nature, and partly because years of being misunderstood had made him economical. "It's not that they were bad people." "No," she agreed. "It's that they didn't." He thought about it. They knew the policy. They didn't know what they were looking at. Claudette nodded slowly. "That's the problem," she said, "and it's fixable, slowly. But it's fixable." He looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up the carrier. "Sargent approves of you," he said. She smiled. "Tell him the feeling's mutual." Warren Holt walked down the hall and out through the front door into a November morning in Thunder Bay, where the sky was the particular gray of granite and the air had that clean sharpness that comes just before the real cold sets in. and Sergeant the Cat looked out through the wire door of his carrier at the parking lot with the serene certainty of an animal who has never once doubted that things will work out. And Claudette Marois stood at the window for a moment and watched them go, and thought about a light in Afghanistan and a phone call to a brother in Sault Ste. Marie and a hinge that had started slowly to move, and then she turned back to the desk, and the flickering light above her, and the paperwork that was already multiplying again, and went back to work.